Hi, this is a recording to accompany the slides for the first out of 2 lectures on the respiratory system. So let's begin. So this is the slide that gives you an overview of what we're going to talk about in this lecture. So the first one is the anatomical and functional division of various tissues and organs of the respiratory system. We're going to continue on by talking about the lungs in terms of its blood and nerve supply, the pleura and a bronchial tree, and then we're going to finish off by talking about the respiratory membrane and alveoli here in terms of its cell types and basic functions. In this slide, we're going to talk about the general functions of the respiratory system. So over here, the main function of the respiratory system is gas exchange. And in terms of gas exchange, what we have over here is we have a depiction of what goes on in the alveoli, right? So what you have is you have the alveoli, which is composed of atmospheric air. And so what you have here is the alveoli on one side of the respiratory membrane, and then you've got the pulmonary capillaries that you can see right over here. So this is the pulmonary capillaries, and you can see red blood cells right over here. At the respiratory membrane, in external respiration occurs. So with external respiration, you've got gas exchange. You have CO2 moving out from the blood into the alveoli, and you've got oxygen moving in from the alveoli air into the blood and into the red blood cells, right? So you've got the gas exchange there happening at the respiratory membrane in the alveoli. The second function of the respiratory tract is that it regulates by blood pH via the regulation of carbon dioxide elimination. So again, how much CO2 gets eliminated out from the pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli air is determined by affects the pH, and therefore this carbon dioxide elimination helps to regulate blood pH. And if you look over here, there is a relationship between the amount of CO2 present in plasma and the amount of hydrogen ions. And so you can see here that if CO2 levels increase, so does hydrogen ions as well. And when hydrogen ion levels increase, then what happens is the pH decreases. Other not so major functions of the respiratory tract include air filtration, because as we actually breathe in air from the atmosphere, from the external environment, it gets filtered, it gets warmed up, it gets humidified. The respiratory system also helps us with our sense of smell, olfaction, as well as speech. It helps us with coughing and during childbirth, and it's also a minor organ of excretion in terms of water and heat. When in talking about the anatomy of the respiratory system, what you can see here is that it can be divided into the upper respiratory tract over here and the lower respiratory tract, as well as the accessory organs. So if you look at the upper respiratory tract, they contain those tissues and organs that are outside of the thorax, outside of the chest cavity. So they include the nasal cavity and nostril, as well as the pharynx, which is where air goes down next, and then the larynx. And it stops just short of the trachea, because the trachea is found within the chest cavity or the thorax. So that's the upper respiratory tract. The lower respiratory tract are those structures that are found within the chest cavity, and they include the thorax over here. And when it actually branches off to the main bronchi, and then from the bronchi, it branches off into smaller and smaller bronchi, and then bronchioles, and then right there, after many different divisions of branching, you end up with the alveoli, where the gas exchange actually takes place. So when we look at the respiratory tract, what happens is that gas exchange only occurs right at the end. And then the third anatomical division of the respiratory tract are those accessory structures. So air can come in and out of the oral cavity. The rib cage rises and so expands and contracts with breathing, as well as the respiratory muscles. So the main respiratory muscles is the diaphragm, and so that's the only one that's in play with passive breathing. And with active breathing, there are other accessory muscles that come into play to actually expand the chest further and to contract it even further than what happens during passive breathing. When we look at the functional divisions of the respiratory tract, everything except for the alveoli is considered the conducting zone. Because when air goes into the nasal cavity, gets warmed and filtered and humidified by the nasal cavity, there's no gas exchange happening. Similar to when the air goes in and out of the pharynx, in and out of the larynx, in and out of the trachea, in and out of the bronchioles, there's no gas exchange that happens. So the purpose of those structures is to actually move or conduct air in and out of the lungs, right? And then, so if you look over here, it includes everything in the upper respiratory tract, components of the lower respiratory tract that are not involved in gas exchange. So basically everything except for the alveoli, and then the accessory structures. So these are all involved in moving air and in and out of the lungs. The respiratory zone is where the gas exchange comes in. So that includes the terminal bronchioles, the alveolar duct, the alveoli itself, and then the pulmonary capillaries, right? And these two being key because that's where gas exchange happens. So oxygen goes from the alveolar air into the pulmonary capillaries, and then CO2 goes the opposite way. So let's talk about, starting from the top down to the alveoli. We're going to start off with the nose and then progress further and further down the respiratory tract. So function of the nose over here, passageway for air going in and out of the lungs. This is where the sense of smell or olfaction happens. And in the nose, mucus is produced to trap and remove large particulate matter from the air, right? And we know that if we breathe in like a ton of smoke or a ton of particulate matter, hopefully the mucus that's produced by the nose helps to trap it and remove it. The nose also contains a rich blood supply to warm and moisten the air that comes in, because the air that comes in typically is dry. And this is also a source of, a runny nose when that rich blood supply actually leaks and makes our nose run. In terms of the components of the nose, there's the outside, the external nose, right? That contributes to the outward appearance of our nose. And then there's the internal nose called the nasal cavity. And the nasal cavity is divided in the middle by the septum, right? Into the, so that air comes in from the right and left nostrils. And within that, it's divided into the meatus, 3 meatus, and 3 conchae. And you can see over here, the conchae are inferior, middle, and superior. So basically what happens is air goes in through the nose, and then you've got these 3 lots of meatus and conchae, which basically splits the air out into 3 different tiers. And what happens is when air goes through the tiers, so it would be tears, not tears from the eyes. What happens is it when it splits up into these 3 different levels, then air is warmed and cleansed and humidified, right? So again, by the time it actually goes through to the next part, which is the pharynx, then it's warmed, humidified, and filtered air. We also have the paranasal sinuses, and so the paranasal sinuses are 4 pairs of air-containing spaces that open or drain into the nasal cavity. And we've looked at these paranasal sinuses before when we're talking about the skull, right? So what happens is you've got these 4 pairs of air-filled spaces, and these air-filled spaces are lined with pseudostratified, so it looks like more than one level, but it really is just one layer of epithelial cell. And these pseudostratified epithelium have got the cilia, and it's also rich with goblet cells. So function of goblet cells is to produce mucus, and so mucus is produced, and then the cilia help to move the mucus with whatever debris that it traps away from the sinuses, right? For it to be to leave into the external environment. So a few functions of the paranasal sinuses: it lightens the skull, warms and moistens the air as well, and it produces mucus, and it affects speech, right? Which is why when we have a cold and our paranasal sinuses are filled up with mucus, our voice sounds different, because it affects the resonance of our voice. Next little bit is when we talk about pseudostratified epithelium in the paranasal sinuses, we also have the same thing as the respiratory epithelium. So again, respiratory epithelium, pseudostratified, looks like more than one layer, but it really is just one layer. It's got those cilia that I talked about before. It's columnar, so it's taller than it is wide. And it has a lot of goblet cells, right? So goblet cells and cilia, again, in the rest of the respiratory system, act in the same way as they do in the paranasal sinus. Apart from this, what happens is that within the respiratory epithelium, there are also lysosomal enzymes, which then help to remove pathogens, not just debris, but pathogens. So viruses, bacteria that enter into the respiratory tract. They also help to secrete defensins, which, as the name suggests, has defensive properties, so antibacterial properties. And also it's because it's just effectively one layer of epithelium, there is a rich blood supply that warms the air as it actually makes its way down the respiratory tract. From the nose, the nasal cavity, air then goes into the pharynx. And what you can see here is that there's an opening into the pharynx from the nasal cavity as well as from the mouth. And so the pharynx can be divided into 3 different parts, and the 3 different parts, when you look at it, are self-explanatory. So the first part, the one that's most superior, is called the nasopharynx. So again, it connects to the nose. The middle part is called the oropharynx, so it connects to the mouth. And then the third part is called the laryngopharynx, so it connects to the larynx, right? So when you look over here, the first part, the nasopharynx, is a passageway for just air. So it's continuous with the nasal cavity. It is lined with pseudostratified columnar ciliated epithelium. And basically what happens is air moves down it, and as it goes there, it's warmed up, it's humidified, as well as the mucus is there to trap debris and bacteria and pathogens. Then what happens is air then moves from the nasopharynx down to the laryngopharynx. And what you can see here is the laryngopharynx has got an opening from the mouth. So this part of the pharynx is a passageway for not only air, but also anything that we eat or drink, right? And so because it actually is a passageway for food as well as drink, the chunks of food that we swallow from the mouth that goes into the oropharynx is usually still fairly chunky. And so the epithelium over here is different from the epithelium in the nasopharynx. So we want lots of different layers, so stratified and squamous, so flat. And this lots of different layer flat epithelium protects against the abrasive movement of the chunks of food that we swallow. And then the third part of the pharynx is called the laryngopharynx, right over here. And again, food and drink also move down there. But what you can see here is at the anterior, at the front end of the laryngopharynx, what you can see here is you've got this epiglottis. And this epiglottis acts like a flap, which closes when we swallow in order to actually push food away from the larynx and the esophagus, and to push food down into the esophagus, right? And then from the esophagus, it goes to the rest of the digestive tract. And so when we swallow and when food moves down from the oropharynx into the laryngopharynx, the epiglottis closes. And so it stops food from going down into the trachea, right? And when we're breathing, what happens is the epiglottis is in this position. And so that allows air to actually go straight from the oropharynx, from the nasopharynx into the oropharynx, down into this part of the laryngopharynx, and then into the trachea, right? So it's a multi-purpose tube, which then directs air down into the trachea, the larynx and the trachea, and directs food and drink into the esophagus. And so when we actually talk about food going down the wrong way, then it's starting to perhaps make its way down into the larynx, and we want to actually cough it back up into the oropharynx so it can go down to the esophagus. And again, the laryngopharynx, because food and drink goes down it, has the same type of epithelium tissue as the oropharynx. So stratified squamous epithelium with goblet cells. Next part of the respiratory tract is the larynx, also known as the voice box. So as the name suggests, this is where sound and speech is generated. We talked about the epiglottis as being a flexible lid that covers the opening to the trachea when food goes down the laryngopharynx. There's also the glottis and the subglottis, which both work together to make sound and speech. So when you look over here, swallowing moves the pharynx and larynx upwards. So it makes the pharynx larger and moves the epiglottis downwards to close the opening to the trachea, right? So as I said, what happens is when the epiglottis closes, then food is directed into the esophagus and not down the larynx and the trachea. So again, this is the larynx over here. The pharynx is superior to it, and then you've got the trachea and the esophagus right behind the trachea. The next part is the trachea. So the trachea is also called the windpipe. Again, it's where air goes to next after it enters in through the nasal cavity, the pharynx, the larynx. And the interesting part about the trachea is it's made, it's got, as you can see here, the same sort of epithelium with cilia and goblet cells, again, to remove more debris and pathogens that still make its way down in the trachea. And as you can see, the location of the trachea is in between the larynx and before the trachea splits into the primary bronchi, into the left and the right primary bronchi over here. The anatomy of the trachea is very interesting because if you look at the anatomy of this trachea, you can see that it's rings of cartilage but the rings of cartilage are not complete. So the rings of cartilage are C-shaped, as you can see right over here. And it's got a space where there's no cartilage right over here where the esophagus sits, right? So the esophagus and the trachea are right next to each other, the trachea being in front of the esophagus. And you can see here you've got the trachea in front, the esophagus right behind it, and then you've got the cervical vertebra distal to the esophagus. And so one of the reason why the tracheal rings are incomplete and C-shaped rather than O-shaped is because it's right next to the esophagus. And it's very important when food or drink goes down the esophagus, because that allows the esophagus to bulge into the empty cartilage-less part of the trachea, so that food and drink can move down the esophagus easily, right? So you've got the stacks of these C rings right here down the trachea, and this it also helps when air moves in and out. It helps the trachea from collapsing, and what happens is when it splits up into the primary bronchi, then the rings in the primary bronchi don't have to be C-shaped, so they're O-shaped. Okay, you've got also fibroelastic membrane that allows the trachea to stretch and expand slightly during breathing. So the next is the lungs. So in between the trachea and the lungs, you've got the primary bronchus, which then splits up into the secondary bronchus, which then splits up into the tertiary bronchus. And if you look over here, it split up multiple times into smaller and smaller bronchial, and so that's what they call the bronchial tree. And I think there's like 20 something levels of the bronchial tree, where it goes smaller and smaller and smaller. As you can see here, the lungs are divided into lobes with so in the right lung you've got 3 different lobes, in the left lung you've got 2 lobes, and what you can see here are the lobes are divided from each other by these intralobular septum. Remember, we've seen the word septum before, so it just acts to divide different parts of an organ. And then when you look at where the lungs sit, it sits on either side of the heart, that's over here, and it's bordered by the diaphragm on the inferior portion, the lungs, the heart, as well as the chest cavity over here. Right. The main purpose of the lungs is air distribution, so it's still part of the conducting zone. So it distributes air from the trachea down into the various levels of the bronchial tree down to the alveoli, right? And in spreading this air down through many different levels of the bronchial tree, what happens is that it actually allows the air to enter into multiple million alveoli, which then helps with gas exchange. In terms of the blood and nerve supply of the lungs, so it's the pulmonary system that supplies the lungs. And so you've got the pulmonary artery over here that contains deoxygenated blood that's coming from the right ventricle, right? So you've got the systemic circulation going. So you've got the systemic circulation pushing blood into the right atrium, into the right ventricle, and then from the right ventricle it goes into the pulmonary circulation. And in terms of the pulmonary circulation, what happens is from the heart we've got pulmonary arteries, right? And this pulmonary arteries contain deoxygenated blood. It goes into the pulmonary capillaries, where oxygen enters into the blood and carbon dioxide leaves. And then from the pulmonary capillaries, then it goes into the pulmonary venous system. And so the blood in the pulmonary veins, the pulmonary venous system, is oxygenated, right? And then from the pulmonary veins, it gets collected into the left atrium of the heart, left atrium, left ventricle, and then to the body into the systemic circulation. So that is the blood supply. In terms of the nerve innervation or the nerve supply, when we're talking about the bronchial, so these are these tubes that lead directly to the alveoli. What we can see is this tubes at the stage where it goes into the alveolar sac is mainly made out of smooth muscle. And we know that smooth muscle can be constricted or relaxed. And so when you have an bronchial over here that has the parasympathetic nervous system acting on it, it becomes smaller, right? And when you have the sympathetic nervous system acting on it, the bronchioles then become bigger. And the bigger the bronchioles, the more air can go in and out. Whereas the smaller the bronchioles, less air can go in and out. And this makes sense because when we're at rest, parasympathetic nervous system is dominant. We don't need that much air. But when we're running away from the bear, we want more air in and out. And so the sympathetic nervous system kicks in. Bronchioles get bigger. More air can come in and out. In terms of the nerve supply, we've got the parasympathetic nervous system coming in through the vagus nerve, and then the sympathetic nervous system coming in through the sympathetic chain ganglia at the T2 thoracic level, 2 and T5. When we go to, again, still looking at the lungs, we're going to the pleura, and the pleura of the lungs is the coverings on the outside of the lungs, right? So it's a serous membrane of the lungs. So we've got two layers of pleura. The first layer, the innermost layer, is called the visceral layer, and this is basically stuck to the lungs, right? A lung extends into and lines the lung fissures. And then the outer layer is called the parietal layer, and the parietal layer of the pleura lines the entire thoracic cavity on the inside. So if you look at the lungs over here, the parietal pleura is on the outside, and then the visceral pleura is stuck onto the lungs. And so what happens is there is a space or a cavity, and that space or cavity is called the pleural cavity. The pleural cavity contains pleural fluid, right? And so what happens is that there's fluid in the pleural cavity over here. And that pleural fluid helps to actually stick the lungs to the thoracic cavity on the inside. And so when we breathe in, the reason we breathe in is because our chest cavity expands, becomes bigger. And so as the chest cavity expands, becomes bigger, the lungs are kind of stuck to the thoracic cavity. And so the lungs can expand as well, right? So the pleural fluid in the pleural cavity helps to stick the lungs to the chest cavity, and so as the thoracic cage expands, the lungs also expand. As the thoracic cage contracts, the lungs also contract, and that helps with movement of air in and out of the lungs that we'll see in the next lecture. In terms of the bronchial tree, as I said, you've got the trachea over here, splits into primary bronchi, then the primary bronchi then splits into secondary bronchi splits into tertiary bronchi, on and on and on, 23 levels of branching, right? And so, and as it becomes smaller and smaller, then what happens is air then gets distributed into smaller and smaller passageways, and so the surface area gets bigger. As the air goes through the different levels of the bronchi, as the bronchi gets smaller, a couple of things happen. One is that in terms of the epithelium, it changes from the pseudostratified ciliated epithelium with goblet cells at the larger levels of the bronchi. It changes from that to just ciliated simple columnar to non-ciliated simple cuboidal epithelium. So it goes from pseudostratified columnar to ciliated simple columnar to non-ciliated simple cuboidal epithelium at the smaller levels. And what you can see here, hopefully, when it gets to like the 15th level of the bronchial tree, 15th level of the bronchial tree, we don't need to produce that much mucus anymore, because all the mucus would have been trapped further up the bronchial tree, and we don't need that much goblet cells anymore, and we don't need that much cilia to actually move the debris in the mucus away. So that's one difference as it gets to smaller and smaller bronchial. The other thing, as it becomes smaller and smaller, what happens is that the proportion of cartilage decreases and the proportion of small muscle increases. So if you look over here, what happens is there's a lot of cartilage at this level, at the primary and the secondary and the tertiary level of the bronchi, but as it goes to the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, there's no need for cartilage, and so the cartilage then gives way to smooth muscle. And the other thing with smooth muscle is then it's easier to contract and relax to actually control the amount of air going in and out. So when bronchial constriction happens with the vagus nerve or the parasympathetic nervous system, less air can go in and out. And when the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in, bronchodilation enlarges the bronchial tubes, more air can go in and out, more gas exchange can happen. Right? And so you can see over here, primary, secondary, tertiary, bronchial, terminal bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, and then down to the alveolar sacs, the ducts, and the alveoli itself. This is a lovely picture over here because it shows you just how many levels of exist in the bronchial trees, right? So you've got trachea here, first, primary, secondary, and then it goes into a whole many different levels. So it looks like a tree. That's why they call it the bronchial tree. Next thing on here is the respiratory membrane and the alveoli. So the alveoli is part of the respiratory zone. This is where gas exchange comes in. Everything else is a tube for air transport, right? And so at the level of the alveoli, what you have here is you have the terminal bronchiole, the last level, and from air in the terminal bronchiole as you breathe air in goes from the terminal bronchiole to the respiratory bronchiole. And from the respiratory bronchiole, it goes into these alveoli. A clump of alveoli is called an alveoli sac. You can see that there are pores, there are holes in between in the alveoli that connects this alveoli to the one next to it and connects that alveoli to the one next to it. So basically, air just doesn't flow into a dead-end alveoli. The alveoli also has, each alveolus, single alveolus, has these pores to allow air to go in and out of adjacent alveoli, the alveoli next to it. Alveoli duct over here is this last tube of smooth muscle, which then opens into the alveolar the cluster of alveoli or the alveoli sac. So I talked about the pores. When we look at the alveolus itself, you can see that each single alveolus has those pores. It also has capillaries, right? A very rich blood supply. And you can see this rich blood supply in this alveoli sac over here. And you can also see it right over here. So you can see this is where the air goes in. All right, the empty spaces, but what you can see here is all the red bits is where the capillaries are. So there's a very, very rich blood supply over here. In terms of the cells, there are three main types of cells there. The first one is the type 1 alveoli cell, most common, most numerous, and the alveoli, type 1 alveoli cell has got simple one-layer squamous set flat alveoli cell to promote gas exchange, right? Very thin, flat layer of epithelium so that gases can go in and out of that type 1 alveoli cell. Again, when there's type 1, there's type 2. The type 2 alveoli cells are also called the septal cells, and the purpose of the septal cells is to produce surfactant. We'll look at surfactant in the next couple of slides. And the surfactant are very important in allowing the alveolus to actually open again so that gas exchange can happen. And then the third type of cell is called the alveolar macrophages. And like macrophages everywhere else in the body, it helps to remove debris and any pathogens that actually have made it down into the alveoli. So they're phagocytic, so they basically trap debris, trap pathogens, and then destroy them. Type 2 alveolar cells produce surfactant. Surfactant is a liquid that acts as a detergent, so it reduces the stickiness of water. Right? So what happens is the surfactant is produced by these yellow cells over here and the type 2 alveolar or septal cells, and the surfactant coats the inner layer, the inner space of the alveoli. And in coating the inner surface of the alveoli, it helps to reduce surface tension. So let's do this. Let's see how it works. So when we breathe out, what happens is air is pushed out of the alveoli, air is pushed out of the lungs. And when air moves out of the lungs, what happens is this thin-walled alveoli will have a tendency to collapse because it's just one single layer thin, right? So as air moves out, what happens is the alveoli shrinks. The alveoli size is reduced. So it goes from being this big to maybe this small, right? When air comes in, the alveoli needs to expand again. And what happens is surface tension keeps the alveoli small, and it takes a lot to actually make the alveoli expand again. This is where surfactant comes in. So surfactant reduces the surface tension, so reduce the stickiness of water-to-water connection. And surfactant increases compliance, so increases the easiness at which the alveoli can open up again. So it prevents the alveoli from collapsing, and it increases compliance. And so with surfactant present, the alveoli then can become bigger again. And when it becomes bigger, the surface area is larger, and so gas exchange can happen more easily. Without surfactant, what happens is that the alveoli tends to stay small, and it takes a lot for it to actually expand again, right? And it tends to keep it small such that the alveoli can collapse, and the alveoli can then only reopen when we breathe a lot of air into the lungs quickly, right? And so it's easier to breathe in the presence of surfactant than it is when surfactant is absent. Now, gas exchange happens at the level of the alveoli, And what you can see here is that the sac of alveoli contains a lot of pulmonary capillaries and is fed by the pulmonary arteries, right? Deoxygenated pulmonary arteries or arterioles going into the pulmonary capillaries, and then it picks up oxygen there and it leaves the pulmonary capillary bed through the pulmonary veins, right? So you've got this rich supply. So this is an awesome picture where they basically removed the single layer alveoli sac from here. And so you can see that it's got lots and lots of capillaries all around the alveoli sac that you can see over here. Some features that help gas exchange across the alveoli, the respiratory membrane. So you've got the capillaries over here, you've got the alveolar space over here. So some features is that the walls of the alveoli and the capillaries are very thin. So simple squamous epithelium on the alveoli side and the same on the pulmonary capillary side. The other thing is that the surface area of both the alveolar and the capillaries are huge, right? So again, the larger the surface area, the easier it is for exchange to happen. And with that large surface area, we also have a lot of blood going into these relative to the volume of capacity. We've got a lot of blood going through the lung capillaries so that there is maximum chance for oxygen to actually enter from the alveolar air into the capillaries and for CO2 to actually do the opposite. So again, what you have here is you've got the pulmonary capillaries, you've got oxygen entering in from the alveolar air into the blood vessels, and you can see some oxygen is dissolved in plasma, but most of the oxygen is bound to hemoglobin, whereas the CO2, you've got CO2 that's dissolved in plasma, you've got CO2 that's carried as carbonic acid, you've got CO2 that's bound to hemoglobin, actually leaving the capillaries to enter into the alveolar air. Some other factors that influence gas exchange is the alveolar ventilation, so the air that's found in the alveolar space. There is the amount of air that goes in and out in a unit time, in a minute, so that's the respiratory minute volume, as well as the pressure gradient between various different gases in the alveolar air compared to the blood in the lung capillaries. Last thing I'm going to mention is the ventilation-perfusion ratio. So when we talk about ventilation, we're talking about air going in and out of the lungs. When we talk about perfusion, we're talking about blood going through the pulmonary capillaries. Now, the ratio of air going into the lungs and blood going into the pulmonary capillaries has to be optimum, and the optimal or the most efficient the efficiency is called the VQ ratio, right? So the VQ ratio is the efficiency of gas exchange that can be maintained by matching ventilation with perfusion. So the VQ ratio is important to ensure that carbon dioxide is removed from blood efficiently and that the maximum amount of oxygen actually enters into the blood. So the VQ ratio makes it efficient for gas exchange to occur.